OU men's basketball started conference play pretty well on Saturday with a 71-63 win over Iowa State, a game they controlled for most of the game, but down the stretch, they needed to make some timely plays to close that one out. We're here to break all that down, plus what is going to be a pretty eventful, tough week for this Oklahoma Sooners team. My name is Jesse Crittenden. This is another episode of In the Paint, talking about all things OU basketball, and I am joined, as always, by Brody Lusk, fellow basketball connoisseur and recruiting guy over at OUinsider.com with me. Brody, OU's 1-0 in conference play. Solid win against Iowa State. What was your takeaway from the Big 12 opener for OU?
Yeah, first of all, I thought that was a must-win game, given the slate of games they have this week. Two incredibly tough games. So to win that one at home, they had to win it. My main takeaway, and we kind of talked about this heading into the game, was it was kind of coming down to which backcourt would play better. Would it be Tamin Lipsey and Keshawn Gilbert, or would it be Milos Uzan and JV McCollum? And it was clearly Uzan and McCollum. They outplayed both Lipsey and Gilbert in that game, and Milos Uzan really stepped up. And another player that stepped up was Latrey Darthur. I mean, he was 3 for 4 from behind the arc, and he had been in a slump. So for him to step up, that was definitely, in my opinion, a great sign for Oklahoma.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned OU's defense on that Iowa State backcourt. I mean, Lipsey with 4 points, 1 of 10 shooting. Keyshawn Gilbert, 6 points, 3 of 5 shooting. I think that's as much as anything else that OU did offensively, and I thought there were good moments for OU offensively. It did start with their defense, which is the identity, I think, for this team. It's the identity that all of Porter Moser's teams have had. And I think OU did. I mean, especially in the second half. Now Iowa State got it a little bit going in the second half, offensively, but in the first half, Brody 12 of 31 shooting, 39% from the floor, 1 of 8 from three. OU actually did a really good job against Iowa State from the 3-point line. Iowa State just 3 of 16. But you're right, man. Let's talk about Los real quick, because Los is, through the first 13 games of the season, through non-conference play, been kind of up and down. There were some good moments, but especially difficulty shooting. I think trying to figure out that balance with him and Javian in the backcourt. And I think that was easily Los's best game of the season, really, in terms of the stakes, how meaningful it was for you to get that win. I mean, 12 points, 4 boards, 5 assists, 5 of 9 shooting, hit a couple of really big threes, especially one late on kind of a scramble offensive rebound. I think it was Latrey that threw that, or no, it was Waldo. It was Rivaldo Soares that threw that kick out to him. How big was it to see Los have that kind of game, and what does it mean moving forward?
It was huge. That was kind of my biggest question mark heading into that game was how would he step up and play? And, he had a lot of, all of his baskets were kind of timely shots. A lot of times Iowa State would start to go on a run and Uzan would get a big basket for Oklahoma. So to me, that's just a great sign to see him step up. And I think his performance, his stat line is kind of going to be your average Uzan stat line in Big 12 play. I don't think he's going to go for 20 points every single night. I think he's more so your guy who's going to go in, get some timely buckets and be your facilitator. And, he played really well. He was 2 of 5 from 3-point range, but, he hit 2 big ones. And the first one he hit was in the first half. And that was kind of when you're like, okay, he's hitting it. He hit a 3. That's a great sign. So I definitely think it's massive. They're really going to need him in these next 2 games this week. And, he really stepped up this past week. And they actually put him on Mama Silovic in the first half, which was kind of interesting to me. And Mama Silovic didn't do anything until that second half. He kind of had that run where he was making some tough shots. So defensively, I also thought Uzan played pretty well for the most part.
No, I agree. Also, I thought OU got a really big lift from the bench. I mean, you mentioned the trade Darhart. I mean, 11 points. He hit 3 of 4 threes, which was really big after that 1 of 7 against Monmouth that he put out. A lot of those looks were open. He just missed them. Not against Iowa State. 11 big points. Rivaldo Soares, I mean, a team high 9 rebounds. And again, some of those rebounds, especially down the stretch, were huge. He played 29 minutes. That was the third most on the team. I thought Hughley did a couple of nice things, but you mentioned the backcourt. Let's talk about Los's backcourt partner, Javian McCollum, who led the team in scoring, 15 points, 6 of 16 shooting. Thought there were some good moments. Then I think there were also some moments where you could tell he was tired.
Mhm.
37 minutes for
Yeah.
JV to open conference play. He also had 5 assists. I mean, him and Lowe's combined for 10 assists. The team had 17 assists on 24 makes. Thought the passing was good. But JV, Brody, I'm curious. I think it's pretty clear that JVN is going to be the guy that takes the most shots in conference play. That's what's going to happen. But I'm curious from your perspective, what you saw from him, and is this? I mean, is 37 minutes going to be regular for him, or do you think this team's going to need to try to get him some breaks now and then? Because he looked fatigued to me down the stretch.
I think if you could get it down to like 34, 33 with just some timely breaks before media timeouts, and Moser did a pretty good job with that for the most part. But I think just more so, I mean, he played a ton of minutes and he missed some shots he missed some open looks. They ran that baseline out of bounds play to him about, I think, maybe even 5 or 4 times. The corner three. And he made, I think, the first one he attempted, he made it. Then he also missed some that were open. And so 3 for 10, it's 30%, which is not terrible.
It's not
But
bad.
I do think, he's definitely going to be the scorer. But there was a lot of shots that, he did miss that I think he won't miss very much, in future games. But he didn't score too much down the stretch, but he played
His
very well.
passing,
His
his
passing was
passing.
great. He had that assist to Dart Hard, which led to the three, and then he had the pass to Godwin, and that was 5 straight points right there for Oklahoma, which came up big. And I think he actually had like 3 straight assists down the stretch of that game.
That's right. It was one to Godwin for a layup. Then he had dart hard three, and then the Godwin layup that you mentioned, and that was after Iowa State took a lead.
Yeah,
They took a 1 point lead with about 4 minutes to go, and then Javian had 3 straight assists, 7-0 run to get OU back to lead. But that was actually part of a 14-5 run for OU to close the game. That was key to me, Brody, because we saw this team really the last 2 years struggle down the stretch of games. I mean, last year they lost 4 games by 3 or fewer points in conference play. What does this mean? What did you see that was encouraging? I mean, obviously OU closed out the game, but what did you see from the way they closed out that game that's encouraging moving forward?
yeah. I mean, as soon as Iowa State took that lead with around 4 minutes left, that was their first lead of the game, and I was kind of like, okay, this is when we've seen teams in the past they would fold, and Iowa State would go on to win that game, and they win a close game and take one in Norman. But I was really encouraged to see the way that team played, and partly they did it. I want to say Milos Uzan was on the bench for most of that
A
run.
lot of it.
Yeah. So and Rivaldo Soares came up big in that run. He didn't score. I don't think he scored at all late in that game, but he just makes so many plays. Hustle plays. And you mentioned the Uzan three earlier, which was, I believe that one was late in the game. That was off of Soares kind of dove and saved it off of just a weird tip. But yeah, the last 4 minutes, it was huge just to see the way the team responded to Iowa State taking their first lead. They really cracked down defensively. They had a lot of good defensive possessions. They rebounded it well. And then they went down there and they scored a lot of buckets. And I mean, that one stretch of Godwin layup, dart hard three, and Godwin layup, I think that speaks to the depth of this team because down the stretch, those shots were not made by your number one scoring option, number two scoring option, or even your number three scoring option. They were made by, Godwin and Dart Hard. And I also think Oweh, he was 8 for 10 from free throws. All those came in the second half. So I did think the free throw shooting was also pretty encouraging because that had been an issue at North Carolina. They just missed a ton of free throws. So that was also something that I found to be encouraging.
That crunch time execution was huge for OU, especially when you look at what they have coming up. And, I've already talked to a few people. I've done a couple of radio hits where I've been asked a lot about Kansas, about OU's game against number 3 Kansas on Saturday. But I've said, don't look ahead to number 3 Kansas because OU's got a tough game against TCU in Fort Worth on Wednesday. I believe that game is on ESPN2. I think it's on ESPN2.
Yep.
What time is that game at 8, 7 or 8?
8 p.m.
It's 8 p.m. That's right.
Yeah.
God, thank you for having that info. I should have already had 8 o'clock on Wednesday, ESPN2. This is a TCU team. They're not ranked. They've had I mean, they've it's been a little bit uneven. They're 11-3, lost to Clemson in early December by 8. Then they lost to Nevada at home. Actually, both of those games they lost at home. But then over the weekend, we saw what this TCU team can do, bro. I mean, they lost by 2 at Kansas, 83-81, a game that had a weird moment or two from the officials down the stretch. I think TCU in some ways probably feels like they should have won that game. But Brody, just take it away. What's your mindset going into, I think, what's maybe not under the radar, but I think it's a Big 12 road game. They're all hard. And it's their first of 2 road games this week. What stands out to you about this matchup?
Yeah, and when you're Oklahoma right now, ranked number 9, that's another thing to take in consideration because this is not just a solid Big 12 team that's going into Fort Worth. This is a top 10 team that's going into Fort Worth. So a team that already lost late down the stretch in Kansas. They're already 0-1. They got to win their home games. They've got a big home game. So they're going to give it, their all, as will every single Big 12 team. But this is just an incredibly interesting TCU team because they had Trey Tennyson, who went for like 20 points, and he's actually like their 7th or 6th leading scorer. They've got a ton of different guys. Everyone's going to be familiar with Avery Anderson from Oklahoma State. They've got Micah Peavy, who's been there for a bit now, and he's starting to develop into someone really good. And then they've got Emmanuel Miller. And so I think this is just a very solid team. And I think they're on the level of Iowa State. Porter Moser said he thinks Iowa State's, I think he said a top 10 team in the country. I think TCU is just as good. They're deep. They're experienced. They've got a lot of different guards. They bring Jameer Nelson Jr. off the bench. That kid is a stud.
No, I agree with you, man. I actually think, look, and it's the AP poll is not always, we've still got a ton of season left to go. There's a lot that can happen in conference play. Iowa State's a good team. I think in some ways this TCU team actually might be a little bit more of a challenge for OU. I think they're a little bit more athletic. They do a really good job of forcing turnovers. I mean, they're forcing over 17 a game. That's third in the Big 12. They're third in offense. And the Big 12 averaging almost 86 points a game. You mentioned it, man. They've got a lot of talent, but Emmanuel Miller, 16 a game, 6 boards, 3 assists, shooting 50% from the floor, 37% from 3. He's kind of been killing it everywhere. And of course, as a lot of people probably remember, this is a TCU team that handed it to OU both games last year. Both those wins were by 14 or more, including in Fort Worth. TCU won that game by nearly 30. So this has been a tough matchup for OU really in the Porter Moser era. What are you looking for from an OU perspective, for them to come out with again, what's an important game?
I'll be honest, I'm really looking at the bigs. Ernest Ude is TCU's big, and a lot of people might remember him from he was at Kansas last year. And he kind of had his coming out moment in college basketball in Norman. He really stepped up for Kansas and played really well. Tanner Groves and Sam Godwin couldn't handle him, but hey, they really couldn't handle anyone last year. So I think this is a different Sam Godwin. I think he'll be able to play pretty well, but Ude is really physical. He's more physical than Robert Jones with what Iowa State had going on. This is a physical big man, and I think John Hughley is going to have to play some solid minutes because this is a big that's going to punish you in the paint, and he's a really good passer. And they've also got Emmanuel Miller. So this is a really deep team, and I think Oklahoma in some ways matches up really well, but in some ways also doesn't match up the greatest. They've got a lot of guys that could beat you. And so the way they play is I like the way they play. They're pretty up tempo from what I saw watching that Kansas game. But yeah, I'm looking at the big men as the typical as what I'm trying to see the most of. But it's a road game in the Big 12. This is, I think, Oklahoma's first true road game. And so you're wanting to see how Javian McCollum is going to perform against a crowd, with the environment they're going to have there. It always seems to be a solid environment down there. And then you add in that Oklahoma's a top 10 team, probably should be, just as good. So I'm interested to see how, late game shot making is as well.
It's all that's really good. And I think to add to that, I'm really curious about, I think 3-point shooting is going to be a really big part of this game. TCU is dead last in the Big 12 in 3-point makes, just 84. They've taken the second fewest threes in the Big 12. They've taken one more 3 than Kansas, who is dead last in 3-point attempts. TCU is also middle of the pack in 3-point shooting percentage. where OU I mean, I think OU is going to have an advantage there. I think that's going to be key. I think for one, it makes it easier for OU's defense if they know TCU's not really hunting that 3-point shot. OU can put a little bit more towards the rim. And two, I think it's going to be, I think OU's ability not only to get some threes off. I mean, they're fifth in they're fifth in the Big 12 in 3-point makes. I think if OU can shoot well, if they can get some threes up, I mean, they shot 10 of 25 against Iowa State from the 3-point line. Brody, when we didn't even talk about that. We talked about 3-point shooting being a question mark heading
Yeah.
into conference play. They shot the ball pretty well against Iowa State. I think that's encouraging. But to me, I'm looking at the 3-point shooting, and then I'm gonna be. I don't want to beat this into the ground, but I'm curious to see what Javian McCollum does, because his game against Iowa State was really interesting. It was clear Iowa State put a lot of their effort into stopping him, and also again, Javian played a lot of minutes. So I mean, I don't know. What's a player? I mean, you mentioned the bigs, but for both teams, but who's a player that you're looking at for OU in terms of just not only being key to the game, but also just seeing how they play and what to take away from it?
Yeah, you mentioned Javian McCollum. I think Otega Owe, because we saw what he did non-conference. I'm interested to see what the dynamic's going to be with what he's going to do in Big 12 play, because I don't think he's going to be a 15 points per game scorer, but can he continue to play solid defense? And he's got to stay out of foul trouble. I think that would be huge for Oklahoma. So, and then one more would be John Hughley. He had a really nice one dribble pull up mid range jumper that I haven't really seen a big man his size do, but he hasn't really made it. I might be wrong, but it feels like he hasn't shot the ball well since that USC game, or down in San Diego.
He hasn't, not really.
Yeah. So I'm interested to see what that looks like. And not to look ahead against Kansas, but you're going to have to play your backup big probably a lot of minutes, because someone will end up in foul trouble in Allen Fieldhouse. It always happens. So you'd like to get John Hughley. You'd like to see a solid performance out of his game just to get more confidence in him, because Godwin, he's played really well, but I think Hughley just has a higher ceiling against these more physical big men. And, he's also more of a threat from beyond the arc if he can start hitting jumpers.
As we've said, Brody, can't overlook this TCU team, not only because they're good, not only because they're athletic, but because OU ends the week with a game at Kansas on Saturday. It puts the spotlight on games like this, where, I mean, it is a good team, but it's not Kansas on the road. If OU can get these kind of wins, then it helps you stack up wins. It takes the pressure off. But if they lose Wednesday, then it puts a even bigger spotlight this weekend on Kansas. We're going to be here to break it all down, Brody. We'll be back again for another installment of In the Paint later this week to talk about OU's game against TCU, however that goes, and to preview what's going to be a huge showdown in Lawrence this weekend, a place OU has not won in over 2 decades. But that's going to do it for us here in this installment of In the Paint. Everybody knows you can subscribe this OU Insider YouTube channel. You're going to find plenty of content from Brody and I about basketball, plenty of football content. Look, OU's about to officially hire a new defensive coordinator in Zach Alley. Got tons of content here. Also at OUinsider.com. Head over there, become a VIP subscriber. You'll find all kinds of written content from everybody on the OU Insider team, plus behind the scenes information and news that you won't quite get in front of the paywall. But exciting time for OU, not to mention softball starts in a month. Big things happening right now. And yeah, this is an OU basketball team that's 13-1, starting conference playoff on the right foot. Big week this week. We'll be here to break it all down later this week on another episode of In the Paint.